the anecdotal reports are hard to overlook. You have Tim Ferriss, you have Joe Rogan, you have Aubrey Marcus, you have Elon Musk, you have Bill Gates, you have Steve Jobs, you have Aaron Rodgers. The list goes on and on of very high performing creatives and entrepreneurs who have openly talked about how beneficial psychedelics have been for them.
What's up, guys? Welcome back to another episode of The Dime. I'm Brian Fields, and with me, as always, is Infini. And this week, we've got a very special guest, Paul F. Austin, entrepreneur, author, and coach. Paul, thanks for taking the time. How you doing today?
Hey, Brian. Good to be here. I'm in Truckee, a little ski town outside of Tahoe. And I'm stoked to talk about microdosing and psychedelics and anything else that you want to go into. So I'm looking forward.
Love it. Kellen, how are you doing?
I'm doing really well. Excited to talk to Paul, cover all those topics he just mentioned, How are you doing, Brian?
Yeah, I'm excited. Microdosing is a topic that I feel like not enough people understand on the levels that we're going to get into today. And I'm really excited to have Paul kind of dive deep. And Paul, before we get into the fun stuff, Kellen and I got a little East Coast, West Coast battle. And I know you've lived in New York, and I'm just going to have to ask you for the record, if you had to choose a coast to live and you had all the money in the world, which would you choose?
I would choose New York. That's fair. I would choose New York. I'll tell you why. You can always get out in the winters, right? So it's easy to fly to Mexico City. It's easy to fly to the south of France. It's easy to fly to Argentina, whatever it is. And I grew up in the Midwest. I grew up in Michigan outside Grand Rapids. So I'm used to like small town, suburban lifestyle. And I moved to New York when I was 26. Just when some of the third wave of microdosing stuff was starting to take place. And so I met some very, from my lens, some very influential people in my life that I'm still very close to this day. And I love how New York is equidistant between California and Europe. So I can be in London, or I've been spending more time in Lisbon lately. I can be there in 6 hours, or I could be to LA in 6 hours. I think for me, the challenge with the West Coast, and I've lived in San Diego the last couple of years. The weather is beautiful. The people are also great and phenomenal. I love spending time outside, but it's a 12-hour flight one way to get to Europe, and so that's harder to do. So I'd say New York first, San Diego a very very close second at this point.
I love it. Let the record reflect, Kellen.
And I would also say I'm more West Coast. I'm more chill and laid back and kind of like easygoing. And when people knew that I lived in New York, like, you live in New York, like that doesn't add up. But just the food, the culture, the people, the proximity, all of that makes New York hard. It really is the greatest city in the world. People, go, but
you did a good job answering a stacked question. You know what I
mean? We're just going to cut out the other part. It's just New York. So Paul, for our listeners unfamiliar about you, can you give a little background about yourself and kind of how you found your way into the psychedelic space?
Yeah, so, I touched on this already, but I grew up in a pretty traditional and sheltered family in the Midwest. My parents still live in the same house that I was basically born in 33 years ago. I have two sisters who live 20 minutes either way of my parents, a couple nieces now, which is really beautiful. So the family unit in a small town was always very important. And we were still, I would say, politically progressive. My mom was a feminist in the 70s. They voted Democrat. So not fundamentalist, not even conservative, but definitely very, very traditional. And so as part of that, we would go to church every Sunday for, 3-4 hours for the first 18 years of my life. It was to the point where I couldn't spend the night at a friend's house on a Saturday night because church was always Sunday morning and it was required and obligatory. And when I was 16, I started to, this was like a day after I got my driver's license at the age of 16, I started to smoke weed because I was free and I could explore. And so I smoked weed a few times with my best friend in high school. Within a couple months, my parents found out. The story is kind of funny. Everyone remembers, probably who's my age, at least our age, AOL Instant Messenger. And so I was instant messaging my best friend about us smoking weed that night, like after like a high school football game. And I accidentally left the conversation up on my parents' computer because we just had one computer that we all use. And so my mom saw it, printed it out, like circled all these things. And within a couple days, we sat down and my dad looked at me and was like, I can't believe you would do this. I'm so disappointed. And said something that I'll never forget, which is like, I haven't been this disappointed since my brother passed away in a car accident, 35 years ago. So this goes to show you just how intense the conditioning and sort of brainwashing was around illegal drugs. And at that point, I blame my parents, but in retrospect, I don't blame my parents. It's simply in the context and the environment in which they grew up. And so that same friend who introduced me to cannabis at the age of 16 introduced me to psilocybin mushrooms when I was 19. Soon after, I tried LSD for the first time. I had a very transformative, profound experience. And those early psychedelic experiences when I was 19, 20, trying to figure out what I was going to do, who I was going to be, led me down a path of, I would say, freedom and exploration. At the age of 21, I moved to Turkey, where I taught English for a year. And soon after that, I started this digital nomad lifestyle, right? Where I lived in Thailand, in Chiang Mai, I lived in Budapest, I lived in Lisbon, I lived in Oaxaca. And while in Budapest, this was 2015, I was taking LSD with a couple of friends. We were reflecting on sort of the state of the current ecosystems. Cannabis was becoming, I think in 2015, by that point in time, there were 4 states that had legalized fully. California was on the verge of legalizing, I believe, in 2016. It was clear that we were going down a path where cannabis would become recreationally available to the majority of, Americans within a very short time, and that psychedelics would soon follow in those footsteps. And the challenge 10 years ago, 9 years ago, was that most people still thought psychedelics were highly dangerous, that they were addictive, that they were harmful. And so I set out to change that. And I changed that through the lens of microdosing. Third Wave as a brand, as you both know, is very approachable. It's got, a reasonably good vibe and sort of aesthetic going on. And so, having studied history in undergrad, that was my, core focus. I rooted Third Wave in like, what can we learn from the past? And what does the past have to teach us about the future? So what can we learn from the first wave, which was the ancient and indigenous use of psychedelics, ritual, ceremony, connection to nature, even secrets, the mystery of it as what happened in ancient Greece. But then also the second wave, science, ethics, best practices, ideal outcomes or ideal medicines. And the third wave is really about the synthesis between those two. So it's been a fascinating and long trip so far. I've been building in the space for 9 years. Third Wave is more of a media educational platform, but I started a company called Synthesis. We did high dose psilocybin retreats for over 1,000 clients in the Netherlands legally, and then took that model and applied it to Oregon to help create the first legal framework in the United States. And then I've also trained practitioners through our Psychedelic Coaching Institute. So I'm just keen on cultural accessibility. I think these things should be fully legal to any adult who wishes to use them. There does need to be quite a bit of sort of precautions and safety efforts put into place, especially for high doses, because they're quite volcanic and catalytic. But I think microdosing is basically usable by almost everyone. There are exceptions, but almost everyone could benefit from microdosing. And so that's sort of what I've been committed to the last 9-10 years.
I appreciate you breaking all that down, and I'm looking forward to kind of getting into some of the retreats and the microdosing. But the first thing I wanted to bring up and get your opinion on is this quote that I have on your website. Plenty of CEOs who do not talk publicly about their psychedelic use because it would put their entire career at risk. I think that's such a powerful statement. But I before we get into that, I want to understand, why do they take it? And then why do you think it would put their careers at risk?
You want the long answer or the short?
The long answer. The long answer.
Okay.
Long answer.
You want the long answer? All right. So I'll give you. So historical context is when I first got into going like deep down the rabbit hole. Right. When I was like, this could be a brand that I start. I'm interested in sort of an entrepreneurial path. I'm a voracious reader. So I read like 20, 25 books. Right. And I read a lot of history books because I thought, oh, what happened in the 60s and 70s when there was 1,000 clinical papers published is important. What happened in ancient times is important. So I just read and read and read. And one of the things that I came to understand is that drug use is normal. It's a normal evolutionary impulse for us as human beings. We literally have to alter our consciousness in some way. And those who don't actually suffer more than those who do. And the most common drugs that we use to alter our consciousness are tobacco, caffeine, and alcohol, right? And you can track the development of, the use of these 3 drugs with the development of industrialism. So we didn't start actively using these three drugs a lot until like the 17th century, and use grew and grew over time because these drugs helped to support the industrial mindset, which was stimulation during the day to get things done because there were a lot of things that needed to get done. And then destimulation in the evening with alcohol to help unwind and relax and sort of rinse and repeat. Cannabis was the first drug that was basically legalized. And I know there was a use of cannabis in the 19th century and whatnot, but I'm thinking more in modern times. So the first drug that was really legalized that was outside of those three core ones. And that has created this sort of bridge for psychedelics to be more widely used. And why does that matter? Because in industrialism, a lot of the activities that brought value were related to what we call convergent thinking, meaning you know what needs to get done. You just need the energy and the time to get it done, right? This is how the vast majority of our economy was built and developed. There were a few people at the top who made the decisions, right? But the vast majority of the people were just there to execute and make sure things got done. That's shifting now, especially with artificial intelligence, with automation, with this sort of information era and age that we're in, where AI will really focus on doing a lot of that convergent thinking, if you will. We'll tell AI what we need to get done and it'll get it done, like ChatGPT does for writing. And this is very basic so far. We'll see way more development in the next 10 years. And so what that means is the role of a human being when it comes to vocation and work will be much more focused on creativity, problem solving, high level thinking, whereas we enter a more uncertain landscape and it's really not clear what to do, those in leadership positions need to be able to problem solve in a space where there's a lot of unknowns and uncertainties. And psychedelics, I think, more than a drug, more than cannabis, more than obviously alcohol, more than caffeine and tobacco, help with that process of stepping back, looking at things from a broader lens and going, what might be a reasonably logical solution based on the context that we're seeing? And this sort of hypothesis is rooted in a research study that was done in 1966. So Dr. James Fadiman he was a psychologist. He still is a psychologist in Palo Alto, actually in Menlo Park. He lives now. He's sort of the godfather of microdosing. He's the one that talked about it in the Tim Ferriss podcast many years ago, wrote a book called The Psychedelic Explorer's Guide with a chapter dedicated to that. But in the 60s, he was one of the leading sort of researchers and facilitators for the overlap of psychedelics and creativity and problem solving. And he did a research study in 1966 where he took 30 professionals in the Bay Area, asked them to pick a problem that they had been stuck on for over 3 months, and gave them the equivalent of 100 micrograms of LSD, which is not a microdose. This is a very moderate dose of LSD. It was either LSD or mescaline that he gave them, which is the active ingredient in peyote and wachuma. So a similar amount. And said, I want you to use this time to try to problem solve kind of what you're stuck on. And it was something like 80 to 90% of the people who took the psychedelic were able to solve the problem that they had been stuck on. And there were a number of innovative solutions that came out of it. That is really sort of still to this day, one of the only research trials that has been done on psychedelics and problem solving. And yet the anecdotal reports are hard to overlook. You know, you have Tim Ferriss, you have Joe Rogan, you have Aubrey Marcus, you have Elon Musk, you have Bill Gates, you have Steve Jobs, you have Aaron Rodgers. The list goes on of very high performing creatives and entrepreneurs who have openly talked about how beneficial psychedelics have been for them. And so just to sort of bring all of this back and root it from a leadership perspective, CEOs or executive teams need to be more resilient. They need to be more adaptable. They need to learn how to navigate uncertain sort of territory. And I think psychedelics as a drug are one of the best tools to be able to do that. What was the second part of your question? Did that answer most of it?
Why does it put them at risk? But given how you've laid it out, I think it's pretty clear.
And so why that puts them at risk. Good. Okay. So why that puts them at risk. So we all know the anecdote of like, you know, Elon Musk went on Joe Rogan and smoked a blunt. Right. This was maybe 4 or 5 years ago now. And as a result of that, I think Tesla shares dropped substantially because of the potential risk with the SEC, because he was using a federally illegal drug in a legal context. So I think that's really
also
explains everything that needs to be explained.
Every SpaceX employee then now had to get drug tested as well because of those actions. So it forced mandated
Right.
drug testing across all of his companies as well.
Which is insane, as we all know.
Totally.
fucking
Especially
insane.
as you just laid out the value
Literally.
from a cognitive standpoint of kind of using it for creative thinking, because given the framework of the type of challenges his team is solving, there are no sure answers, right? There's like uncertainty to the right, uncertainty to the left, but I have to make a decision, and the decision I'm making has massive repercussions.
And for me, I would say, and I smoke a lot of weed, for better or worse. Psychedelics are a slightly superior substance for that, just because you don't have the same cognitive fog necessarily. And the challenge with cannabis is, and again, I've experienced this, is it can become more of an everyday habit rather than something you do here and there. And when it's done here and there, cannabis, I think, has a very psychedelic effect and can actually substantially help with creativity and problem solving. The challenge that I've always found with it is if it's around, I smoke it. And when I do it consistently, I lose some of that impact. Whereas, I take 50 mics of LSD and I go on a hike, and I just have this sort of a few problems that I'm trying to figure out or solve or work on. And it's like, boom, boom, there's a lot of great new insight that will come through on that hike. So I think, and sort of just to close this gap, speaking about Elon again, he was recently interviewed by Don Lemon, which maybe you two caught parts of, and Don asked him about his ketamine use. And Elon was very open that he uses ketamine because here and there he struggles with depression. And ketamine is a legal substance by the FDA. He has it prescribed by a medical professional. So I think there's more and more capacity and space for even those in leadership positions to openly talk about specifically their ketamine use. The challenge, again, is just until the legal structure, legal policy changes in a more substantial way, the risk isn't worth it necessarily. And hopefully it will be soon, because I do think it's critical that the leaders, creators, and builders of tomorrow are informed and influenced by psychedelics. I think they can be incredibly helpful allies. And that my hypothesis is, by and large, the more leaders we have who work with psychedelics, the better society will become for everyone.
I've always had a question about like psychedelics from a microdosing perspective. Is like psychedelics is a broad description of multiple drugs, right? And so like, is there
Correct.
a purpose that a CEO may use like magic mushrooms over LSD from a microdosing standpoint, right? Like, would they choose A or B based on like what they're maybe trying to achieve through the microdosing exercise or regimen, I guess maybe is the better way to describe that.
Yeah, the protocol, right, that they're looking to weave
implement.
in. So I had a tweet the other day, and I just like to post, as we all know, the things that do well on social are the things that are controversial. And so psychedelic, for better or worse, psychedelic comes from a Greek word that means mind manifesting. And really it means soul manifesting. Psyche is the Greek word for mind, and the Greeks perceive the mind as also being part of the soul. This is what Plato talked about with his concept of duality and all these sorts of things. And then delos means to manifest, right? And when this term was coined in the 1960s, I think early 1960s, by Aldous Huxley and a guy named Humphrey Osgood, who was a psychiatrist who guided Huxley through his first psychedelic experience. They were specifically focused on three main classes of drugs: tryptamines, which is DMT, psilocybin, ayahuasca, 5-MeO-DMT. So tryptamine, lysergamides, LSD is the most common lysergamide, most well known, and then phenethylamines. And the two most common phenethylamines are mescaline, which is in San Pedro and peyote, and MDMA is also a phenethylamine. And so ketamine doesn't fall within that. Cannabis doesn't fall within that. Iboga or ibogaine doesn't fall within that. So there's a lot of questions of what is a psychedelic and what is not a psychedelic. And so the context of why someone is coming into this and where they're at matters a lot. And the metaphor that I often teach in our training program is the lotus flower metaphor. The lotus flower represents the symbol of enlightenment in Buddhism. And the idea of it is when we plant that new seed of self through a high dose psychedelic experience, we're planting a new seed of self that allows this more enlightened sense of self to emerge and blossom. But for that to be successful, we have to have healthy soil. So we have to till the soil. That means trauma work, healing work, shadow work. Once we've done that trauma work and healing work, then it's about that planting the new seed of self, death and rebirth. the ego dissolution aspect of psychedelics. Once that new seed of self is planted, we then need to nourish that seed with sunlight and water, and that's integration with psychedelics. So exercise, meditation, diet, just lifestyle practices that support a more, we could say, centered, equanimous state of being is really central to that. And then looking at things like ayahuasca and 5-MeO-DMT and potentially iboga that really help that lotus flower to fully blossom, if you will. So I think regardless of whether someone's in a leadership position or not, what we find with folks who are quite new to psychedelic work or inner work, contemplative work, is that there is some initial healing to be done, that there is some initial trauma work to be done, that even if it's not a big T trauma, like I count myself very fortunate that with the way that I was raised, I didn't have any major emotional abuse or sexual abuse, or like I reasonably good parenting. I had a loving home that I grew up in. I played sports. I played violin. I did great, with my academics. I was bullied quite a bit when I was like 10, 11, 12, which was where some of the trauma came from in terms of, I can be a bit prickly. I'm not all that social. I prefer to be more introverted. But again, I count myself very fortunate that I didn't have any big T traumas. And yet still, when I did my early psychedelic work, there was guilt and shame and attachment issues and other types of wounding that came up that I had to understand and navigate through a more therapeutic process. So I think that is what I would say is often a first step. Even if someone, again, even if they're not on SSRIs, even if they don't have a diagnosis, even if they're more interested in sort of exploring the upper realms of potential, there's just something that comes up in those very early experiences. After that, then we look to, so that's often ketamine or MDMA is the way that I teach. That ketamine or MDMA is a great substance, it's a great medicine to till that soil because it's a bit less intense than taking 5 grams of mushrooms in the dark. Right. But once you've tilled that soil, once you feel like, okay, I have a good sort of rich compost to draw from, then a high dose of psilocybin can be a great way to dissolve the ego, death and rebirth, plant that new seed of self. That could also be a high dose of LSD, but people have a hard time finding LSD. Some people are still scared of it because of the stigma from the 1950s and 60s. So usually I say a high dose of psilocybin is a great way for that death and rebirth process. And then microdosing in the sort of week to 2 weeks to 3 weeks to 4 weeks after that high dose experience elongates the window of neuroplasticity. So the reason psychedelics can be so effective at catalyzing behavioral change is because of their impact on the brain and their impact on neuroplasticity. And so microdosing is a great tool then to elongate that window of neuroplasticity. Usually after a high dose experience, people will find that for 2 or 3 weeks after, things more in flow, they can meditate more often, they're kinder, they're more compassionate, they're more relational, but that after 2 or 3 weeks, a lot of that starts to dissipate. And so what we coach people on is microdose. And that can elongate that window from anywhere to 6 to 8 weeks, which just means that's the actual amount of time you need to start a new habit, right? It's hard to just start a new habit within 2 to 3 weeks. But as an example, if you can focus on meditation and you have a 6 to 8 week window where it just feels easier and you're like, I'm going to do this, then you establish that habit, which is a huge win for anyone who's coming out of a psychedelic experience. One more sort of piece of nuance then in terms of your response would be the difference between psilocybin and LSD from a microdosing perspective. And to explain this, I'll talk a little bit about the sort of neurochemistry, the neurobiology of what happens when you take LSD versus psilocybin. So as I mentioned, LSD is a lysergamide, psilocybin is a tryptamine. Tryptamines are more serotonergic, meaning more serotonin. Serotonin as a neurochemical is related to contentment, present, emotion, somatic, right? So it has a little bit more to do with sort of the felt sense of living, the felt sense of experience, the present moment, the here and now. LSD, lysergamides are more dopamine, right? And dopamine is the molecule of more, and that's related to focus, attention, and motivation. And so what I find in terms of folks who are interested in LSD versus psilocybin is those who are interested in psilocybin, couple contexts, they may have a history of SSRI use and they're like, I'm fucking sick of these pharmaceuticals. I don't want to be hooked on anything synthetic. I want to use something natural. I want to use something that helps me get back in touch with my body and all that. And psilocybin can be a great tool for that. And especially in our worlds, there are a lot of people who just want to microdose LSD because they want to be more in flow. They want to have a greater cognitive capacity. They want to be creative and brainstorming. And for cognition, LSD is superior because it has that impact on dopamine. And what I hear time and time again is like, damn, when I microdose LSD, I can get everything I need to get done. And I feel like there's a sense of playfulness that's brought to it. Whereas with modafinil or Vyvanse or Adderall or some of these more intense either nootropics or psychiatric medications for ADHD, as we've probably all experienced to some degree, there's kind of this like constriction, this tightening, and this intensity where you get things done, but you kind of feel hungover or a little off, that evening or the next day or whatever it is, or there's just a sense of stress and heaviness that can come with it. And so what I find with LSD is the playfulness remains and the capacity to get things done is still there.
Are the steps that you laid out for a retreat or for a general purpose for someone interested in establishing a protocol?
So great question. So the steps that let's go back to the lotus flower metaphor, right? That would think of that more as like over the trajectory of 5 to 7 to 10 years. You may start with MDMA-assisted psychotherapy or ketamine-assisted psychotherapy. You may do that for anywhere from 6 months to 18 months. After that, you may go forward with a high dose of psilocybin, and you may go on a retreat in Mexico or Oregon, depending on where it's legal, and do that. And then you have substances like ayahuasca. I didn't drink ayahuasca until like I had been working with psychedelics for 7 years. So I think there's a necessity in being patient with the path. A lot of people hear about psychedelics. They hear how impactful psychedelics can be. They hear how it's a incredible catalyst and a life-changing thing. And so they rush into it and they try to get it done as soon as possible. And usually what I coach folks on and help people to see is like, this could be the rest of your life. So like, take it slow, be intentional, find great providers. I think that matters a lot. And just commit to having the courage to like, basically face all aspects of who you are, both your demons, but also the things that make you lovable and great and beautiful, right? So I think for me, it's like, I talked about the neuroplasticity already. It's a huge key benefit, especially for leaders and creators, is the benefits of neuroplasticity with psychedelic. But the second thing that is just as important is the sense of courage that comes from deep psychedelic work. When we take a psychedelic, it downregulates the amygdala, which is the sort of reptilian brain. And that's where a lot of our fear response comes from. And so when we're working either with low doses or high doses of psychedelics, it just opens up the space where we can actually ask ourselves the hard questions. We can make the difficult decisions. We can have the difficult conversations that we need to have. And we can still stay regulated within that sort of confrontation of darkness or evil or difficulty, which I think is a very valuable thing that psychedelics offer, especially for those in leadership positions. As we all have heard, like, there's a quote that goes something like the quality of your life is dictated by your willingness to have difficult conversations. I think that might be a Jocko Willink quote. I can't remember precisely, but I think that's true. And psychedelics often help with that, is tapping into the bigger picture of why this matters and still being compassionate within, let's say, that difficult conversation. If you have to fire someone, if you have to give someone feedback, if you have to communicate with a partner or, negotiate, there can still be a sense of connection within that and a willingness to say the hard and difficult thing that you need to say to move the deal forward.
So if someone is interested in kind of embarking on this journey and they're like, hey, I want to go on a retreat, like what is the prep work like? Like mentally, where should they kind of put that on the timeline? Is that something that they're like, hey, I'm going to do kind of prep work for a couple years and then kind of use that to choose the location? Like, how does someone kind of approach this whole situation?
Yeah, so there's really, I would say, three main options is what I would provide as context. One is to do it at home with virtual support. So when COVID hit, basically for the year after COVID, people weren't going many places. And the federal government passed something called the Ryan Haight Act, which allowed for scheduled substances to be prescribed virtually. This is specifically for ADHD medication, but it also applied to ketamine. And so over the last 4 years, hundreds of thousands of people have worked with ketamine virtually, where ketamine will be sent to your house. I mean, you have to talk with a medical professional, you have to get a prescription, but then ketamine will be sent to your house. And you have anywhere from 4 to 6 experiences at home with a trip sitter. It could just be a friend who's there just in case you need to go to the bathroom, you need water, you need a hand to hold. And then there's virtual coaching before and after. So we offer that through Third Wave. So if someone's listening to this and they're like, I would love to stay in the comfort of my own home. I don't want to pay thousands of dollars to go to Costa Rica or Mexico or travel a bunch, but I'm really interested in the benefit. I would say check out our program, Personalized Psychedelic Coaching. It's essentially a 2-month program where we guide you through a high dose experience followed by a microdosing protocol and provide coaching support before and after as part of that.
All from the comfort of your own home?
All from the comfort of your own home, which is, as we all know, incredibly convenient and helpful. And setting, as we all know, is so important. And so if you're in a setting that you're just so comfortable with, that can be, really helpful and beneficial. I would say the second common way to do this is, as you mentioned, Kellen, to go on retreat, right? To pick a retreat in a legal place. I mentioned spot that we had set up in the Netherlands. So there's plenty in the Netherlands, in Jamaica, in Costa Rica, in Mexico, now in Oregon, because Oregon legalized psilocybin, in Colorado. And we have a listing of vetted retreat centers on Third Wave. So if you just go to thethirdwave.co and go to our directory section, you'll find dozens of vetted and verified retreat centers that you can attend, whether it's ayahuasca, psilocybin, ketamine, wachuma. There's a lot there. And the reason we make that available is because a lot of people who are new to this space don't necessarily have the nuance and education to discern between what makes for a great retreat center or a great provider compared to a good one compared to a not good one. And so we're really focused on that process. That can cost anywhere from $1,000 to $10,000, depending on the center that you go to. Typically, most centers will provide preparation calls in the 4 to 6 weeks leading up. These will be group preparation calls, and they'll provide some education on how to prepare.
This is like the tilling of the soil, right? You're referring to?
Correct. Yeah. That would be the sort of starting of that. And then after you go on the retreat, there might be 4 to 6 weeks of integration. You again might have 2 or 3 group calls, and then some retreats will also allow to, you might pay extra and get some one-on-one support if that's what you need. So those are what I would say. Those are the 2 legal and more common ways. The third way would just be to find an underground community. So, Brian, you're in Long Island. Kellen, you're usually in Colorado. Kellen, now plant medicines are legal in Colorado, so you can find actually a legal community to do medicine work with, which is great. Brian, as you're probably aware, there's dozens of plant medicine circles in New York that are happening every weekend. So you get hooked up or in with the right people, you get an invitation. It's illegal in most of these, again, not in Colorado, that's important to emphasize, but in most states at this point in time, it's illegal. And, law enforcement, the DEA, the police are not really interested at all in prosecuting or pursuing psychedelic work. In fact, there's a bill that's being passed or going to be passed this year in California. And so the police lobby has been asked about their opinion, and they essentially say they have no opinion because half of the police force has worked with psychedelics and half has not. So we're at this really interesting moment in time where psychedelics, there's been so much education in the last 10 years. A lot of people who are EMTs, firefighters, policemen, first responders are working with psychedelics because they drink a lot, because they have a lot of trauma from the work, and it's really helping them in a substantial way. And we have this thing called fentanyl, which is actually a harmful drug and highly addictive that the DEA and federal agencies are focusing almost all their time and attention on. And so what's key with the underground ceremonies, especially if someone's brand new to this, is just to ask the right questions. And I would say this is true across the board. Ask, how much experience do you have with this medicine? How much medicine are you serving? What's the group size? Have people gone through a vetting process before you've allowed them in? Are you trauma informed? Do you know how to work with trauma if it might come up in a medicine ceremony? Do you offer prep and integration as part of this? So I think what's really key to emphasize, if there's one sort of takeaway from this conversation, is if someone's interested in doing this work, whether with microdosing or high dosing, interviewing whoever you're choosing to work with as a provider, whether it's a retreat center, whether it's underground, whether it's a therapist, whether it's a coach, interviewing them is essential. Because by asking the right questions, you will be able to discern and understand if this person is going to be a great facilitator or coach for you as you go into this work.
So with California becoming hopefully legalizing, right? It's going to be a big piece of the puzzle, right? Moving towards full legalization. And so what do you envision like a full federally legal psychedelic market to look like? Is it like similar to cannabis, or is it like only through like a certified providers, kind of like how ketamine is approaching it with clinicians? Like, how do you envision that whole industry kind of rolling out?
So, as you both know, and this is probably just a slip of tongue, cannabis is not federally legal. I mean, hemp is technically federally legal, but still it's not available, right? Through, I think
Yeah.
maybe through the FDA, you can get something prescribed for epilepsy specifically,
Yes. Yeah.
but that's about it. And it's barely at all, right? So, this is really a state driven shift and change, a grassroots, really even more so than psychedelics, the grassroots movement with cannabis. And that has both its pros and its cons, which we probably don't have time to get into now. But there's upsides and downsides to having a very grassroots, deregulated, even to some degree unscientific. Not to say there isn't a ton of great science and research on cannabis, but the movement that was behind it to drive recreational use was not necessarily informed by a lot of scientific practice and methodology. And we're now seeing some of the challenges of that. Like I've experienced this personally. I definitely have a cannabis addiction, for better or worse. I can go off of it for months at a time, but again, it just seems to find its way back in. So with psychedelics, I think it's going to be federally approved this year. MDMA will be approved by the FDA to treat PTSD very likely this year, with rollout happening in December or January 2025. Psilocybin, which is the alkaloid in magic mushrooms, will likely be legalized by the FDA, probably with rollout in 2027. So within 3 years, we could see federally approved psilocybin for depression, treatment-resistant depression, and major depressive disorder. And then I would say there's probably going to be anywhere from 5 to 10 other psychedelics, microdoses of LSD for depression, psilocybin analogs for depression, potentially ibogaine for certain forms of addiction. We could see anywhere from 5 to 10 more psychedelics that are approved by the FDA before the end of the decade, so by 2030. And that's incredibly exciting. The challenge with that is there's a lot of regulation, there's a lot of rules, the cost is extremely expensive. It's unclear if health insurance will cover the cost because it's a very new type of treatment modality. It's not just like SSRIs where you take a pill every day at your home. For a lot of these treatments, you need a therapist who is there and present with you, which just turns the overall sort of paradigm and structure on its head. My guess would be about 10% of people who work with psychedelics will do so through that FDA approved path in the next 10 years. The way that I think the vast majority of people will work with psychedelics will be either on a state basis, like what happened in Colorado, what's happening in California, what's happened in Oregon, or it'll happen in a more, let's say, just localized sort of community church model all over the United States, where there will be religious protection for people who want to work with psychedelic plant medicines. They'll be able to do it as part of a nonprofit. It'll be accessible to everyone. The cost will be very low. And it'll essentially be like a community church model where there still needs to be some vetting, some interviews, an application process, but there won't necessarily be a cost prohibitive model that is developed. And this is what's currently legal in Colorado. So the more regulated policy will be put into place later this year in Colorado. But currently in Colorado, you can't charge for like the mushrooms. Like I can't just sell mushrooms to a friend. But if I say I'm going to host a retreat or a ceremony in Aspen, I did this last year, 45 people are going to attend. It's a retreat. And I'm just going to give everyone mushrooms as part of that, donate it to them. That's totally legal and accessible. And I think that's how the vast majority of use will occur and happen.
Very generous of you.
Probably 80 to 90% of it basically will be in that more community church model. And the state model, like what's happened in Oregon, what may happen in California, what's happened in Colorado, is somewhere between that FDA approval and the sort of community church model. There's some regulations put in place. There's a licensed facilitator and licensed clinic model. You know, there's some oversight and governance and regulation, but it's not restricted to people who have a clinical diagnosis. The facilitator licenses aren't restricted to people who are clinical therapists or psychiatrists, right? Even if you're a non-clinician, you can get licensed by the state. So there's a bit more wiggle room and openness within that overall.
Are there certain groups of people, given everyone you've you've experienced this with or seen go through the retreats that benefit from an age perspective or a time of their life? Is there any sort of window of people that you think that are considering it that are more beneficial? And in the same regard, is there a window of people you think they think it's the right time for them, but given what's going on, it's likely not the best time?
So I'll start with the second one, just because it's a little bit simpler. So the main contraindication for psychedelic use is schizophrenia. So if someone has schizophrenia or a family history of schizophrenia, and they're under the age of 26, they have a family history of schizophrenia, that's important to emphasize. They should not do or work with psychedelics, probably shouldn't work with cannabis either. They need to be very careful and cautious about how they navigate these things. I would also say someone who's on lithium, which usually people who have schizophrenia or struggle with it, they may be on lithium. Lithium is really the only contraindication for psilocybin in particular. And then the other context that I would add there is if someone has had a very recent traumatizing experience, like the example that I would give would be like you signed up for a retreat in Mexico, you're planning to go, and then a week before it happens, your dad dies. You were really close with your dad, right? Like maybe better to pause and sort of push that psychedelic retreat out until you feel a bit more stable internally to go in that. So I would say those are like the two main contexts and cautions: schizophrenia and then a recent traumatic experience that may cause a certain level of instability before you actually go into a high dose experience. I would say those who would benefit most from working with psychedelics, and this may be controversial, but I'll say it anyway, would be very young adults. So adults who are 16, 17, 18, 19, almost as a rite of passage, to be done in a intentional way, like a men's circle or with a parent or with a community, right? So a rite of passage, I think, can be an incredibly beneficial thing at a young age because it helps to sort of reset the orientation of that individual. That's again, when I go, wow, I'm so grateful for this is, when I was working with LSD at the age of 19, these were very positive, insightful, and beneficial experiences that completely changed the trajectory of my life. And so I think if we have more young adults who are able to experience this in a very beautiful way, the work they choose to pursue will be different. The relationships they choose to pursue will be different. Their sort of overall capacity to navigate the challenges and uncertainties of your 20s will be different. So I think it could be really important at a younger age.
Sorry to cut you off,
that
but
initiation.
Any fear that could go in the wrong direction? I know for you had a good experience, but any fear given the age that you just talked about, they could go in the opposite direction?
Great question. So with that being the case, I would refer back to what I said before. There needs to be a clear understanding of family history as it relates to mental health and as it relates to psychosis in particular. There also needs to be probably a lower dose that's done initially, like sort of a stepping up, so you can get a sense of, oh, this is how they respond to a microdose of psilocybin. This is how they respond to a half gram. This is how they respond to a gram. So I think there's ways to mitigate that. But certainly it's more risky than someone who's in their 50s or 60s, right? Because there's a lot of unknowns. And that was always the case with initiation. Some people didn't make it back, not from psychedelic, but most initiations in indigenous communities were very physically dangerous. And so psychedelics almost reproduce or recreate that near-death experience without the risk of physical danger. So I think by far they're the safest way to have a rite of passage or initiation for those who are quite young. And there needs to be, like I said, quite a bit of support done on the front end, assessment done on the front end to ensure it's a great fit. I would say the other people that would benefit most would be people in their 50s and 60s who have been stuck in their same ways for a very long time and who are looking to sort of shake up the snow globe, if you will. That maybe they're at a midlife crisis, maybe they're entering retirement, maybe they've been on SSRIs for a number of years, maybe they're just looking for a new step, a new sense of vitality. I think especially in our culture, the older people get, the more we put them by the wayside. And I think there's something very valuable about the wisdom that comes from elders and how psychedelics can help to revitalize our cultural interest in elderhood, basically, and what that can offer us. And even Michael Pollan said this when he wrote How to Change Your Mind. He's like, I think the people that could benefit most from psychedelic use are people in their 50s or 60s who are sort of stuck in their ways that they've been stuck in for 20 or 30 years now. And they're looking for sort of a new lens, a new perspective that will help them to sort of surrender into the coming of age that they're undergoing. That so much of our medical system, so much of our healthcare system, so much of the way we live is heavily influenced by a fear of death. And so when people in their 50s and 60s have this profound mystical awakening, this death and rebirth experience through psychedelics, it can really help to reframe how we approach and understand dying and death. I think it's something like 95% of money that's spent in healthcare is spent in the last maybe year of someone's life. And I think it's largely because we don't know how to die as a culture. And I think psychedelics could really help us to remember that death is simply a transition and it's not necessarily a jail sentence and something to be fearful or afraid of.
I love it. Paul, we only have time for one more question. So I take you to the mountains, I drop you off, I give you 200 micrograms of LSD, and you can bring 3 people, dead or alive. Who are you bringing?
I love that you, I'm assuming that we follow each other on Twitter because I saw that just the other day that Brian Fields followed me. I'm like, all right, so this should be fun. We'll see what he brings up in this conversation. So I had a tweet, I don't know, that's probably a few months ago now that I pinned, which is like one of my favorite things to do is to take 200 micrograms of LSD and go on the mountain. And it has been, and I do this once every few years still. So I'm grateful that you asked the question. Number one would be this guy named Stuart Brand. So Stuart is like an OG in Silicon Valley tech psychedelic culture. He was part of the Merry Pranksters, Ken Kesey's Merry Pranksters in the 60s. He did LSD with Jim Fadiman back in the day, the psychologist that I mentioned before. Stuart started these things called the acid test, which were with the Grateful Dead. And there's so much more. He started the Whole Earth catalog. He came up with this idea that we should see a picture of the Earth from the universe so we can really kicking off Earth Day and sort of the ecological movement. And he was just incredibly influential at the bridge between the counterculture and cyberculture. And he's still alive. I've actually tweeted at him the past couple of days. I'm trying to link up with him at some point. I'd love to have him on the podcast. And I think he would just be so interesting to talk to. His most recent project is de-extinction. He's attempting to bring woolly mammoths back from the dead to help with climate change. And there's a really good documentary about this called We Are as Gods, because in the Whole Earth catalog, he had a quote which was, "We are as gods, so we might as well get good at it." And he was close friends with Kevin Kelly, who started Wired or was early on at Wired, close friends with Brian Eno, the incredible musician. So there's just a really interesting group there. I'd say the second person would probably be Leonardo da Vinci. I don't need to go into detail about who Leonardo da Vinci was. Inventor, artist, I think the original Renaissance man. And that's something that I aspire to or am interested in, is what is it like to live in that way and have both creativity and craftsmanship at the tip of your fingers. I've read parts of Da Vinci's biography by Walter Isaacson, but yeah, I think it would just be so interesting to spend an afternoon and time with him. And then the third person would be Aldous Huxley. Aldous Huxley is probably my favorite author. I think he wrote Brave New World in the early 30s, 1933. It was very dystopian. It was very cynical. He came from a very wealthy, upper class Oxford family. And when World War II came about, it really opened up this sort of spiritual crisis for him. And as a result, he started to study Vedanta and the Vedantic texts, which is one of the original non-dual sort of lineages. And then soon after that, started to experiment with mescaline and LSD. And just before he died, wrote a book called Island, which was a sort of utopian counterpart to Brave New World. And so, and I think the coolest part about Huxley is when he was on his deathbed dying, he had his wife inject him with 100 micrograms of LSD. And so as he was dying, he was tripping on acid, which is basically what I think all of us should aspire to. So Stuart Brand, Leonardo da Vinci, and Aldous Huxley, those would be the three that I'd go on a microdose with a bunch of acid.
I love it. So for our listeners, they want to get in touch, they want to learn more, where can they find you?
Thethirdwave.co. We have a newsletter. We have a private community that's free to join, which I would encourage people to sign up for, introduce yourselves, or to meet other people who are interested in the space. That's community.thethirdwave.co. thethirdwave.co. If there are any coaches, practitioners, those who want to become coaches or practitioners in this space, we have a training program through the Psychedelic Coaching Institute. You can find that on the Third Wave as well. And then I'm on Instagram and Twitter at Paul Austin 3W, and I'm pretty responsive to DM. So if you heard this show and you want to reach out, you have questions about anything, just hit me up and let me know. And I'm happy to support you.
Appreciate it. Thanks for taking the time. This was a lot of fun.
Thanks, brothers. This is great.
Thanks.
Thanks, Paul.